Okay, in this lecture we're going to be discussing what we call societal transformation. Once again, we're still talking in a macro sense about society because we're going to be talking about society as a whole, the very large elements of society. When we look at modern society, we recognize how large and complex it is with very many pieces. But the question exists, did society always look like this? Or how did we get to the place that we're at today? And it's not because society as it exists today kind of just spontaneously existed or sprung up out of the ground or that's the way it's always been. We definitely recognize that society has transformed over time. So even if we just generically talk about society, we say that society as it exists today is nothing like the way it used to exist in the past, and societies from the past are very different than the ones that exist today, although some of those actually in some form or another actually still do exist. So we can take a look at the idea of were there stages of this transformation over time, and the answer is of course yes, and we can break those stages down. We can give some specific examples, but we can also talk about them in very broad terms. And one of the things we recognize is that for each of these stages, which you see listed over here, I also have space over here to list a social invention. In other words, and we talked about this in the chapter on culture, and we talked about material culture, we know that as human beings advance our technology and learn to do new things and invent new things, this often has a very dramatic change on society, and we're going to take a look at that in some more detail here. So when human beings learn to do new things or invent new things, it can actually result in society on its basic level transforming into another type. So let's take a look here at the very first stage that I've listed up here, and in parentheses behind each of these stages I've listed short abbreviations for those other times when I may be discussing these things or writing them on the board. I won't want to write out these entire things. So these are just shorthand ways of identifying these stages. The very first stage, when we talk about the earliest types of human societies, when human beings first started to convene and live in groups larger than individuals or individual families, is what we call hunter-gatherer societies. And you may have heard this term before. We talk about, sometimes, again, we use other colloquial terms like primitive or, again, prehistorical societies. And we talk about this idea of hunter-gatherer societies, and we can generally broadly come up with some characteristics of these types of societies. Most of the time when we're talking about hunter-gatherer societies, we're talking about very small groups. Okay? It's very difficult for a hunter-gatherer society to exist in very large numbers, and primarily when we talk about this idea of hunter and gatherer, we're referring to food production. So how does this society meet the needs of its members as far as providing them with daily sustenance, the amount of nutrition that they need to survive from day to day to day? So it's exactly what we mean by this. Hunting and gathering both refer to wild food sources. So sources that exist outside of the society itself that members of the society need to go and either hunt in the case of animals or gather in the case of plants or vegetation and then bring back to the society itself. This is sometimes characterized as what we call subsistence existence. A rough way of putting that is 1 day of work equals 1 day of food for these societies. If I was to describe it in terms of an equation, I would actually say that 1 day of work equals 1 day of food. And so in other words, the activities of this society is basically every day working to supply its members with the amount of food it's going to consume that day, and then the very next day the process repeats itself. So if you spend a day hunting, you would come back, eat that food, go back out the next day and hunt. If you were to go out in the wilderness and gather, that is to say dig up roots out of the ground, pick berries or fruit off of trees, gather up other types of vegetation, you would consume that and then go back out the next day. So by definition, these societies need to be small in number because you base just on existing in the wild, it's very difficult to feed very large numbers of people. So these societies tend to keep the numbers small. They're also nomadic, meaning they move around quite a bit. Again, why? Because wild food sources move around quite a bit or are depleted rather rapidly from certain areas. So animals will tend to migrate or to basically go away from where they're being hunted, and it's necessary to keep after them. Wild vegetation sources are depleted, so you picked all the fruit out of a tree, or picked all the vegetables out of a certain area, and then you have to go to where there's more wild food growing. So we talk about these groups being small, the necessity to move around quite a bit. Part of that necessity to move around quite a bit is going to entail people having very little conception of material goods or possessions. So again, you're not going to be burdened with a whole bunch of A, permanent structures, or B, lots of things that you have to move from place to place to place. So when we talk about hunter-gatherer societies, one of the characteristics is usually very little interest or focus on personal possessions or material goods. People generally own with the clothing and tools that they have on their backs, are able to move around quickly. But even more to that, there's a sense of kind of communal existence where all the possessions of that community are owned by all the people. So that leads to another example, or another characteristic of this type of society is one in which there's a lot of equality, very little inequality, what we sometimes call an egalitarian society, one in which, for the most part, people are all considered to be at the same level. I have posted in the D2L shell in this module a clip from a movie called The Gods Must Be Crazy, which is about a 5-minute clip that exemplifies what a hunter-gatherer society is. So I'd ask you to pause here, watch that clip, and then come back. Okay, so having watched The Gods Must Be Crazy and watched that clip, you can clearly see some of the characteristics of a hunter-gatherer society. It's a small group. You can clearly see that there's no permanent structures. It looked like that group could pretty much easily pick up and move around from place to place. They had very few ideas of possessions. As a matter of fact, as you saw in the clip, the introduction of something outside of their society actually causes a lot of disruption into that society. Once again, if you haven't seen that entire movie, it is a very funny movie. You just watched, like I said, about a 3 or 4 minute clip. I believe that's available on Netflix or YouTube. I encourage you to watch it just because it's a very, very funny movie. So, what then would propel this group to change into a different type of society? Well, what human beings learn to do is, again, it's rather inefficient to spend every day, all day, hunting and or gathering just to kind of exist in subsistence. What human beings basically learn to do is, instead of chasing the animals around, that we can keep them in one area. Instead of going out into the wilderness and trying to find vegetation that's edible, we can take the vegetation that we've already eaten, which obviously after you eat most types of vegetation, what's left over are seeds, and we can throw those seeds on the ground. We can even dig up the ground a little bit to make it easier. So basically what human beings learned to do was herd animals and plant gardens. Okay? Again, don't confuse this with farming. That'll be something we come to later. But the social invention that we discuss here is the idea of the domestication of plants and animals. I'm just going to put the word domestication up. So by domesticating animals, we keep them in pens or herds, and again, the word is pasture or pastoral. And by learning that if we throw seeds on the ground, they'll eventually come up into plants that we can pick and then replant the seeds again, is gardening, and we call that horticultural. So human beings progress from a hunter-gatherer society through the domestication of plants and animals into pastoral horticultural societies. And basically what we're talking about here is this allowed a couple of things to happen. First of all, groups could get larger, food production increases. So again, to use a kind of a fake equation, 1 day of work could equal 10 days of food. Okay, so now we're not just producing subsistence amounts of food, we're producing in some cases more than we need, or creating what we call a surplus. So this surplus of food allows for a couple of things, but first of all, even before we get there, the idea of keeping herds in one area or planting gardens will now allow people to more likely stay in a specific area. So one of the things we can talk about is the establishments of settlements. Okay, so people will now start to build more permanent structures, live in small towns, villages, those kind of things. Um, within those settlements, and now we're producing more than the average person could eat in a day, we're producing surplus, allows people now to kind of divide their jobs up. So not everyone's going to be doing the same thing every day. People can now start to specialize in certain type of tasks. So a person who's especially good at making weapons might spend all day doing that. And a person who is good at turning animal skins into clothing is going to do that. Or another person who's especially good at building structures or fences or huts or digging wells is going to spend their time doing that. But while those people are not engaged directly in food production, they are still benefiting from the surplus in society. Well, some people are herding the animals or planting the gardens. What are they going to do with the food that they can't use? They're going to give it to the people in society who are producing these other things. But this also establishes the idea of barter or trade. Okay? So you produced, 10 spears and I have an extra pig. I will give you my pig for those 10 spears. Okay? So we're starting to develop trade, but also with this, we're starting to develop the idea of accumulation of wealth. So whereas in the hunter-gatherer societies, there was this idea that kind of everything belonged to everybody, we're now starting to come up with the idea of individual possessions. We're starting to come up with the ideas of I can have more than you. And when we talk about that idea of people accumulating surplus or accumulating wealth, we start to see that this egalitarian society that we talked about in the hunter-gatherer society becomes somehow skewed. Okay? Now we're talking about people who are in positions of power over other people because of this accumulation of wealth, or some people have more things than others. So we start to talk about the dawn of social inequality. And within this, then we start to see other human behaviors such as wars between various cultures that meet each other, or various civilizations, tribes, however you want to put it. The struggle for power and control over resources. So if you are living in a specific area, obviously in order to keep animals fed and to raise crops, things like water and arable land are all important resources. So cultures or different societies will start to fight each other for those things. And as well as when one society defeats another society, it's often very likely that they will take the people of the society or culture that they defeated as property. So we now see the onset of things like slavery. So we can clearly see that the transition from a hunter-gatherer society into a pastoral horticultural society came with very, very, very many societal changes. Then what did human beings learn to do? Well, as I often talk about, horticulture is gardening. For those of you who are familiar with gardens, have your own gardens. I often ask, is gardening easy? And most people answer no, it's a lot of work. And clearly you're doing that work with your back, with your hands. It's very labor intensive. One of the other things we can say about gardens is they're very easy and susceptible to failure. So for those of you who have ever had your garden wiped out by an early frost, or you get a blight, or a lot of insects, or it just doesn't rain enough, or it rains too much, we definitely know that gardens are very susceptible to failure. Okay? So what do we want to do? Well, we want to increase our food production on a larger scale. So it's very difficult to make a garden bigger without increasing the amount of work you do. One of the things that human beings learned how to do, and this is an actual physical invention, is we invented the plow. Okay? In its simplest form, a plow is just a big old piece of wood or stick that you shove in the ground and drag it around, either with human hands or again, we've already learned how to domesticate animals, so we could use horses, oxen, all sorts of other animals to pull a plow. But basically what a plow allows us to do is turn over huge amounts of area of land. So whereas if the average person would maybe garden a couple square meters or a couple dozen square meters of land, a person with a plow can now turn over square kilometers of land, or hectares, or acres, or whatever else, the measurement, right? But now a single individual working with a plow can now produce what we call farming or agriculture. To go back to our imaginary equation, one person working can produce 100 days of food, okay? So we've gone from subsistence living to creation of surplus, to now the point where a relatively small number of people in a society can produce enough food for the larger society as a whole. Okay, so now we see societies getting incredibly large. Okay, so when we think about a lot of ancient civilizations, again, ancient Egypt being one of the first ones, but clearly Rome, Greece, a lot of these, which we call the dawn of civilization, we generally see as being agricultural societies. Okay, all the way up through, when we talk about human history, and especially Western civilization, the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, up until the British Empire, the American colonies were founded as agricultural societies, okay, benefiting a larger society, but the British Empire. So we clearly know that once we, as human beings, progress to the point of agriculture, we allow these huge surpluses to exist, but also because a very small number of people in society were producing these very large amounts of food, we could clearly see that now culture could develop on a widespread and much more rapid way. So now you had entire portions, we started this division of labor in pastoral horticultural societies with different people doing different things, but now in agricultural societies we have people whose jobs have absolutely nothing to do with food production or are completely removed from it. So we have entire portions of the society given over to things like religion, education, culture, architecture, science. Okay, so I often sometimes say, one of the earliest agricultural societies, ancient Egypt. If you were to go to Egypt today, what would you be there to see? Probably, especially if you were in the Cairo area, and of course everybody says they'd go to see the pyramids. Only in an agricultural society could something, an achievement, an ancient wonder of the world like the pyramids have been accomplished, because you've got this enormous, huge amount of people necessary for it. So the size of society needed to be very large. There had to be a certain number of people dedicated to things like science and architecture, astronomy, which was clearly used in the creation of these enormous large structures, but also even two other things. There's the motive for building the pyramids themselves. They were built by pharaohs as markers of their reigns, of this idea of nobility and royalty and a ruling class. But they were also largely built by enormous amounts of slaves. So people that were at the very bottom end of society. So now we can clearly see that social inequality has become an integral part of society. You have very, very, very rich and powerful people, and you have very, very, very poor and powerless people within a society. So many of the very great inventions of our time were due to the advent of agricultural societies. So again, while we always, to a large degree, had language throughout these things, clearly writing in this thing, mathematics, arithmetic, the numbers, lots of physical inventions came about during this time. We mentioned one earlier in the Middle Ages or the Renaissance. We talked about the printing press. So these are all examples of these huge advances which are only made possible in agricultural societies. We also, again, talked about how inequality now has become an integral part of society. We now have bases of, and we saw some of this in pastoral horticultural societies. Again, I forgot to give some examples of this, things like ancient Mesopotamia, some of the ancient, what we sometimes call pre-civilization. We saw the establishment of things like royalty and nobility, but we clearly know that by agricultural societies we now have dynasties, and we have basically wealth and power being handed down through generations along lines of nobility. Okay, so what transformed us then into the next stage in development when we talk about the difference between agricultural and industrial societies? The basic invention here was the steam engine. So human beings discovered that, obviously we've known for a long time what happens when you boil water. Water turns to steam, but that steam has the ability to turn wheels, and now machinery is invented. So the steam engine rapidly becomes automation and factories, and basically we see a transformation here from production of food in an agricultural society to mass production of goods, okay, manufactured goods. in an industrial society. And again, much more surplus. So now smaller numbers of people, even as agriculture became automated, it was less necessary so the steam engine eventually became the tractor, eventually became combine harvesters, those kind of things. So even smaller numbers of people in society actually had to be concerned with producing food, leaving more people to the production of manufactured goods. So we see this change from rural societies living on farms to industrial societies, people living in cities, being near factories and other places where goods are being manufactured. Whereas in an agricultural society, the majority of people are in charge, are royalty, are monarchs being handed down along lines. The people in industrial societies who are the most powerful are those people who own the factories and the natural resources and transportation necessary for an industrial civilization to survive. These people are generally called industrialists. And so when we think about our own society, in America clearly started as an agricultural society, but after industrialization occurred in Western Europe, England to be specific, in the late 1700s, America rapidly industrialized, and when we think about the people in our society who we consider kind of our own American nobility, we think of people like the Rockefellers and Rothschilds and Carnegies and Hearst. These are all industrialists, and to a large degree, for their time, these people even became more powerful and wealthy even than kings and queens and monarchs of these earlier agricultural stages. We definitely see that the inequality between the wealthy and the poor even becomes more pronounced. So you could say that a king living in medieval Europe clearly was much more rich and powerful than a serf, but when you take a look at their overall lifestyles, they weren't that different. Certainly kings had it better than a peasant, and probably much more likely to eat better and wear better clothing and live in a more comfortable environment. But really, a lot of the same things that plague both groups of people were kind of universal. When we get to the idea of industrial societies, we see that the wealthy have an extremely different lifestyle than the poorest people in society. However, one of the things we can point to in an industrial society is that the overall standard of living in society dramatically increases. So even if we were to compare, let's say, a 1950s factory worker and the king of a European country in medieval Europe, we would clearly, probably most of us as individuals, choose the life of the factory worker. A king certainly is a very rich and powerful person, but basically lives in a stone building, subject to a lot of disease and poor food and uncomfortable temperatures and a general lack of education and access to health and medicine. Whereas a 1950s factory worker, while they might live in what we would consider to be a pretty modest house, probably had access to things like refrigeration and running water and education and medicine and edible food on a regular basis, certainly wasn't going hungry. So we definitely recognize that industrialization raised the standards of living for all those people in those societies. We definitely then talk about what the next transformation was, and there was a transformation. I often throw this out to classes to ask me what they think would transfer a society from industrial to informational societies, and I often get computers. Computers did exist for a very long time. If you use the most broad definition of computers, a thinking machine or a machine that does calculations, we've had those for centuries. In fact, as a matter of fact, if we think about the Industrial Revolution occurring in the United States, or how it occurred in the United States, going all the way up through the 1950s and 60s, we had computers when we landed people on the moon, but we were still considered an industrial society. But if you think about the characteristics of those computers, they were very big, very unwieldy, very slow, very limited in the amount of computations they could produce, and were very limited in who they're available to. So I often say, if you ever saw any pictures of the 1950s, the computers that NASA had during the Apollo moon program, they were the size of buildings, and they were very slow. what made computers what they are today, and that's clearly the invention of the microchip, the ability to take computing power and produce it in a very small way and very rapidly. So it was the microchip that propelled us as a society, speaking about the United States, from an industrial society into an information society. And in an information society, we see this shift away from production and manufacturing to the production, control, and distribution of information. Okay? And when we think about our own society today and we look around, we realize that the vast majority of us in society there's a very small segment of our society, and sometimes we get these complaints, that is actually involved in making things anymore, and the majority of our people and our jobs, and if I think about the students I have, my own job in particular, but I think about many of the jobs that you are training for, you aren't training to go work in a factory somewhere where you're going to screw widgets onto boards. You are going to be dealing in the production and dissemination of information. Okay? So computers, and by virtue of that, with the microchip, allowed for the internet and mass communication, even on a larger scale than previously existed. So we see in an information society this dramatic movement away from production of manufactured goods to control and dissemination of information. What's next? Well, I often sometimes point out at this point, let's look at some of the timeline here. From the very first stages of human society, we were hunter-gatherer societies, so we can talk about maybe, again, there's a lot of argument about exactly when this came about, but if we say the introduction of modern man, Homo sapiens, about 70,000 years ago, roughly, we can say that we engaged in hunter-gatherer societies up to about 10,000 years ago. So for about 60,000 years, perhaps, again, give or take, there's a wide amount of debate about this, but we'll just take those numbers as a rough estimate. But up until about, like I said, just before what we sometimes call prehistory, the dawn of man, we talk about human beings living as hunter and gathering groups. And then for many more thousands of years, we existed in pastoral horticultural societies. Again, we think about ancient Babylon, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the dawn of civilization, the Fertile Crescent, ancient cities like Ur, Babylon, those kind of things. Pastoral horticultural societies. Then in about 4,000 to 6,000 BC, perhaps, we became agricultural societies, one of the earliest, of course, being ancient Egypt. But that existed for about another, from about 4,000 to 6,000 BC to about 2,000, we can almost make it about 1800 AD. So for about another 5,000 or 6,000 years, we were agricultural societies largely. Then we made the shift over to industrial societies, like I said, about the late 1700s, early 1800s, up until about the middle of the 20th century, so for about 200 years. So what's happened? We've gone from thousands of years to a couple of centuries to a couple dozen years. Now we've actually seen, from, if we talk about industrial societies being from about to the 1970s, another 200 years, changes are happening more rapidly, and the distance between them has certainly gotten smaller. So are we on the verge of perhaps another societal transformation? Well, there's a lot of different thoughts about that. One is the idea that the social invention we might be talking about might be the mastery of genetic manipulation, or the being able to manipulate DNA into what we might call a biotech society. Again, we're back to food production. We're starting to recognize that the planet might not be capable of supporting all the people who exist on it. So we're back to looking at ways. So we hear all these debates about genetically modified organisms, both plants and animals, to produce more food. But clearly, if we do change and perfect this manipulation of DNA, it's going to have a lot of effects on things like the human. We've definitely seen in industrial civilizations lengthening of human lifespans. Well, if we perfect DNA, then we talk about things like cloning, or being able to eliminate certain types of genetic diseases or conditions, or being able to perhaps replace or regrow diseased tissue or organs. So we're clearly talking about many different types of things. Again, other people have pointed out that perhaps artificial intelligence is the next great invention that's going to change human society, where we talk about machines that are capable of doing a lot of calculations and thinking independently of human direction. That could certainly change and propel us. So we're on the cusp of this idea of we've seen all these changes happening. We're able to identify the effects of technological advancements and social inventions to changing society, and we also recognize that these changes are happening more rapidly with less time spent at a specific stage. So we can clearly look at the idea that it's very likely we're in for another very important change soon, and that many of us may actually be alive for that transformation.